Last video, we ended on the question of what is a non-fungible asset, right? Because a non-fungible token is supposed to represent the uniqueness of a non-fungible asset. It's supposed to represent the ownership of that non-fungible asset. Okay, so we landed on what does fungibility actually mean, right? And so it's best explained through examples. If we look at asset examples, and these asset examples aren't necessarily fungible, non-fungible, solely in a digital space, we're looking at it holistically. If we were to look at a fungible asset, we would be talking about cash, Bitcoin, because $1 is equal to $1, right? When we exchange $1 for one another, the value stays equal. And the same is true for Bitcoin. Okay, so I hear you saying like, Mo, but like, okay, $1 is $1, right? And one Bitcoin is one Bitcoin. So if I have this Bitcoin or that Bitcoin, it doesn't really matter. Okay, got it. So that's fungibility. Yes. If the asset itself can be exchanged in likeness, in value, it is fungible. Now, there are gray areas here, and we'll get into those later on. But then let's take a look at non-fungible assets. And I took some time to jot down a couple of examples here. One can be watches, right? Another could be plane tickets. And yet another could be stamps. Okay. Let's zoom in a bit more, and let's see why these are defined as non-fungible. But let's go back to this real quick. If we look at cash, and we're looking at trading $1 for $1, $1 for $1 is in likeness because $1's value remains $1, irregardless of the serial code that's printed on it, where it was produced. $1 is $1. You go to a store, you pay with $1, a person will accept $1. Therefore, it is a fungible asset. The exact same is true for Bitcoin. It is a fungible asset. Now that's weird, right? Well, no, it's a digital currency. It's still a currency. Therefore, it has all the hallmarks of a fungible asset. Now, to date, we aren't really using it as much as a currency, right? Like you can't walk into your local mom and pop shop and, spend the Bitcoin and like they accept it. There are certain companies that accept transactions for Bitcoins like Tesla, but it doesn't have mainstream adoption as a currency yet. So currently in the tax code, often it's looked at as an asset class. So there's weirdness here, but one Bitcoin is equal to one other Bitcoin, irregardless of its serial code here, right? Doesn't matter if you had the first Bitcoin ever mined or the last Bitcoin ever mined. The value of one Bitcoin is equal to the value of another Bitcoin. So then we get into the non-fungible territory, right? And we get into this area where we're like, well, why is a watch non-fungible? Well, if you look at it, right? On the left, you can see a gold, very pretty watch here. On the right, you can see a very bland watch. Now, if we assigned an asset class to this, like for instance, this one was a Rolex, and this one was just, a regular Casio. Well, there's immediately a value difference in the money you paid. But, right, you buy a Casio off the shelf for $100. You're not going to go to someone and exchange that in likeness for another Casio because the watch itself has devalued. It hasn't retained value. It's devalued because you've worn it. It's not a collector's item. So you can't say that you can go trade a Casio for a Rolex because a Rolex, if we look at Rolex itself, it usually appreciates. It goes up in value, regardless of if you wore it, depending on the type you had and whether or not you did something to it. And the serial codes here matter. If you have a Rolex that was made 50 years ago, let's say you had a Rolex Daytona, and then you had a Rolex Daytona that was made in 2021, the values are not alike. They're both Daytonas. Don't get me wrong. They're both Daytonas, right? They're the exact same model. So why is one worth more than the other? Because there's an intrinsic value that we as a community give to it, which makes it non-fungible. I can't just go and say, hey, you give me your new Daytona, I'm going to give you my old Daytona. It's not a fair trade. It's not like $1 for $1. No, not at all. And the same is true for stamps or plane tickets, right? Have you ever met a stamp collector? Well, a stamp made in the 1960s is not equal to a stamp made today. And the same is true for a plane ticket. If we got a business class plane ticket, the aisle versus the window seat, they can't be traded in like, because at the end of the day, it's the person himself who determines like, oh, I'd rather have aisle, so I'm rather willing to pay more for it, right? So there's nuances here that determine non-fungibleness. And the same is true actually for cash, right? Because just like stamp collecting, you could do coin collecting. And I remember when the euro came out back in the 2000s, people were collecting coins like crazy because certain emblems were custom printed on it in limited runs, and therefore the value of a €2, although if you went to spend it in the store would be accepted as €2, within the trading community, the value of that €2 coin could be way more than the actual face value of the coin. And that's what determines non-fungibleness. It's what are we willing to give to it as a value, and is it unique to us or not, right? So let's get into some of the characteristics here, the key traits. Well, for something to be non-fungible, it has to be unique. So, like Rolex in a limited run, like the coins in a limited run, it needs to be irreplaceable, right? The first Daytona ever made is always going to be worth more than the second Daytona Rolex ever made. Non-interchangeable. Swapping them doesn't equate in equal value, and that is the key trait of something that's non-fungible. Okay, so we know what makes something non-fungible. But then we go back to the coin example. Fungible versus non-fungible, because cash was fungible, but then I talked to you about coins. The value of an item and its use determines whether it's fungible or non-fungible outside of the traits, right? So the value we assign to it also has to be tied into it. It's not just the key traits. Like we could assign all of these key traits to a Bitcoin, right? The first Bitcoin ever printed has a serial code. It's unique. It's this, that, the other. But also it's the value we assign to it. That's why a coin collected in the 2000s that was a euro at face value is €2, but in the collector space can be worth way more. And that's what makes fungible versus non-fungible so difficult to distinguish. And that's where NFTs come in, right? When we're talking about these non-fungible items, the token represents the ownership of that non-fungible item. In modern days, like if we go back to our example, right? When you buy a Rolex, what's your form of ownership? Like what determines all of this, right? Why do we need non-fungible tokens? That why we need to look a bit deeper into.